Speak to Ian Fraser. Hi Ian, can you hear me?
Hi,
Ian, first of all, what's your background?
Well, I was a financial editor of a newspaper here in Scotland called the Sunday Herald, where I worked from 1999 until 2006. And then I became freelance because I wanted to have more scope to do other things than just newspaper journalism. Since then, I've done a number of BBC documentaries about the financial crisis. Worked with Bloomsbury, which is a publishing company, on a new project called Q Finance, which I helped to launch. I was the consulting editor, qfinance.com. But yeah, mainly just freelance journalism, actually, writing about finance, economics, business.
Now, about a year and a half, I think it was, maybe not so long as that ago, you wrote what I thought was an excellent article about this County NatWest trial back in 1992, where several people were prosecuted, got suspended sentences for fraud, and then managed to get the Court of Appeal to overturn those. Can you just take us back to 92? Why was that trial so significant?
Well, the offence occurred in 87, which was basically a rigged rights issue for a company called Blue Arrow, which was a recruitment consultancy, a UK-based recruitment firm.
Okay, what is exactly a rights issue then?
Well, that's when a company goes to the stock market and wants to raise capital from investors. So it puts together something called a prospectus, and it tells them what it's going to do with the money and persuades them that it's worth their while to give it the money in order to fund a particular type of activity. In this case, it was the acquisition of a US recruitment firm called Manpower that they needed the money for. They wanted to raise about £1 billion at the time.
They got suspended sentences, but they managed to get off. And I think you were saying, and certainly by looking at it, it looked like that the trial was kind of bogged and mired down with annoying complexities.
Yeah, so the reason why the individuals were tried was because they had made stuff up. They pretended that there was demand for the shares in the rights issue when in fact there wasn't any demand, or wasn't much demand for the shares in the rights issue, by buying them themselves using money from NatWest or County NatWest, which was who they worked for. But what happened was there was a one-year jury trial, which was obviously deliberately complexified or whatever, but at the end of that, 4 guys were given between 18-month and 2-year jail terms, suspended sentences. And that was in early 92, I think. And then in July 92, there was the results of a Court of Appeal trial, which basically said the verdict from that was that they were exonerated and had done nothing wrong. But I think what was quite interesting was that on the day of the result of that appeal court trial, a friend of mine, he worked for the Metropolitan Police, I think, at the time, or he may have worked for one of the UK regulators at the time, received a call from a contact of his in the Serious Fraud Office, and the contact from the Serious Fraud Office said to him something along the lines of, the message has come down from on high. There will never again be a criminal prosecution of senior city people, and there will never again be a criminal prosecution of a mainstream city institution. That was what he was told by the person in the Serious Fraud Office on that day in July 92.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because, there doesn't seem to have been much in the way. There have been some prosecutions, Ian, but they haven't really gone. We were talking earlier on, I did a little bit of research on the Libor scandal, for example, that was going on for at least 4 years, and that the fine, out-of-court fine, that the RBS and Barclays settled was only the profits from about 1 week of those 4 years of Libor fraud.
I'm not sure if those figures are exactly right, but overall, there's a long-standing habit within UK financial services regulation to avoid criminal prosecutions if at all possible. And I do think it does stem back to that 92 incident, which happened obviously under John Major. I think there's a long-standing preference for what could be deemed, cosy backroom deals where people will sort of agree never to work in the city again in exchange for the matter not being properly investigated, which is what has happened on a number of recent occasions. It's very interesting. If you look at the parliamentary debates around the time of Big Bang in 86, there's some very interesting debates going on in the Parliament, in the House of Commons at that point, with most of the Labour people aware that fraud was going on in the city, and most of the Conservatives either sort of not aware or wishing to just sort of pretend it wasn't really there. And I think, the habit of basically giving financial criminals an easy ride dates way back to probably 86 and Big Bang. It was partly because, Britain wanted to be seen as a place which was attractive to investment banks and the financial services sector generally, and where they could ply their trade in a relatively light-touch environment, and where, if there was wrongdoing, they wouldn't necessarily face very severe consequences.
Well, that certainly seems to have been what's transpired. Old Labour Oxford economist Martin Summers, what's your thoughts about what Ian's saying here?
And of course, if you get a reputation for being a cheat, people won't lend you their money ultimately. And of course, we're talking here about people like the Chinese and so on, saying, well, we're not going to give you our money because we don't trust you. And that ultimately will be what will undermine them.
Ian, have you got any examples of cases where you think over the last 10 years or so where, I've just mentioned the Libor, I mean, I'm staggered that still there's been no proper fraud prosecution for individual traders or for the directors of these banks for Libor. I mean,
well,
the
it's
figures...
staggering. There is actually currently a tussle between the Department of Justice in the United States and I think it's the Serious Fraud Office here over one person who is seen as the Jesse James, inverted commas, of the global Libor conspiracy. He's a guy called, what's his name again? I've forgotten his name. But he's an English guy, born in London. I think it's something like Hayes. But anyway, the U.S. want to prosecute him. They want to extradite him and prosecute him in the U.S. But unfortunately, the sequence with which evidence has been given means that that's become difficult. And so it seems that he may not be extradited to the U.S., that he may fall into the lap of the much softer Serious Fraud Office, which I'm sure would be to his benefit.
I mean, what's the point of the Serious Fraud Office in the 21st century then if it can't actually do these prosecutions?
Well, I don't know, but it's experience tells us that it's an utterly useless prosecutorial agency. I think it should be disbanded because its track record has been fairly disastrous, especially when you think about the recent Chenguez fiasco, whereby, it's being sued for £100 million by Robert Chenguez, the property developer. It's a disgrace.
Okay, that particular case, Ian, can you just go into that a little bit? Because I understand that they had him arrested for, investigating him for fraud, then decided to back off, at which point he then is now going for the Serious Fraud Office.
Well, that's right, because he thinks his reputation... I mean, he obviously claims that he's innocent, and he thinks the way in which they publicised the fact that he'd been arrested, and I think it was last year, was harmful to his personal reputation, which I'm sure it was, because, the mere fact it's on the front page of every newspaper that he's been arrested and questioned by the SFO, he wasn't charged, is obviously negative. I don't know how wealthy he is, but he's got a lot of borrowed money if he doesn't have any real assets. And so he's now suing them, and it would actually completely destroy them if he wins the case.
I've just been looking up online, Ian, and found it's Thomas Hayes is the individual that the US are trying to extradite.
That's the name, yeah. Thomas Hayes.
Thomas Hayes.
He's also known as Rain Man because he's apparently quite socially inept. What's quite funny about him is that all the banks claim they had absolutely no knowledge that Libor rigging was going on inside their institutions. That's the line we've had from UBS, it's the line we've had from Barclays, it's the line we've had from Royal Bank of Scotland. The top guys claim they had absolutely no knowledge whatsoever that Libor rigging was happening. And yet, in the case of Tom Hayes, he was so brilliant at doing one thing and one thing alone, which was Libor rigging, that banks were prepared to offer vast sums to hire him because they knew he was so brilliant at it. And they knew how he was making the money. They knew he was able to influence the Libor rate. And one example was Citigroup paid him a $5 million signing fee in 2009 when he joined them from UBS. So presumably they weren't just paying this guy a $5 million signing fee if they thought he was just some kind of ordinary guy who was, sitting around in the trading floor not doing very much. They presumably were willing to pay him that because they knew he could move the Libor rate and therefore make them massive, massive profits.
old Labour Oxford economist Martin Summers. It seems a little bit strange where you've got people during the riots arrested the year before last for stealing a bottle of water for, I think it was 4 months, and then somebody who's perpetrating a £1 billion, multi-billion pound fine fraud is then sort of still strutting around the streets of London, drinking in the bars, etc.
Yeah, well, somebody was sent down for stealing a gingerbread man who's just died in prison, actually, who's actually got mental illness issues. But, the fact of the matter is that the Big Bang should never have happened. With hindsight, we can see now that it was an absolutely stupid thing to do, and certainly the splitting of investment banking and retail banking, which was brought in the 30s, which was overturned in the early 90s, both here and in the US, that was also disastrous. And it's because these people have lobbied to be allowed to do what they want. And in the previous era, what right-wing economists like to call financial repression was going on, which means lots of things they were told they couldn't do them, the sort of things they used to do in the run-up to the crash in 1929. And through the Second World War and afterwards, they were put in the box and told to behave themselves. But of course, they didn't like being in that box. They lobbied to get out of it, and Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan let them out. And of course, we are now reaping the whirlwind of those silly decisions.
These fraudsters, Ian, they're probably only afraid of about 3 people. One is the police, the other is the financial press doing deep investigations into them as individuals and exposing them. And the other one is things like the parliamentary committees. Do you think there is any possibility of any of these 3 institutions coming to get them?
Well, there certainly has been a change in the regulatory approach since 2008. We had obviously the massive banking crisis in October 2008, and it's sort of still going on to some extent, but, the near failure of many of the world's leading institutions, including the narrowly averted failure of Royal Bank of Scotland, which at the time was the bank with the largest balance sheet on earth, $3 trillion in assets. And since then, it's fair to say that the regulators have slightly changed their approach. The FSA has gone after the institutions who rigged the Libor rate. So far it's done 3, Barclays, UBS and Royal Bank of Scotland, and there's about another 17 in the offing of other large banks, including Lloyds and HSBC, which will, I think, have to make similar settlements with the FSA and its partners, who are the Department of Justice and the Commodities Futures Trading Commission in Washington.
But sorry to stop you there, Ian, but as I pointed out earlier with these figures, which may be a little bit wrong, but I've looked at the amounts of the fines and the amounts of money being made in the Libor rigging. It isn't actually really a punishment, is it? If you're only fined the amount of profit you've made 1 week over 4 years of crime.
Well, it speaks volumes that on the day that the Royal Bank of Scotland settled with these three regulatory authorities, its share price went up 8%. That is showing that investors believe it got off lightly. The fact that they marked up the shares by 8% on the day of the settlement, I think it was 8. So the settlements are obviously totally inadequate and probably won't stop banks from misbehaving or manipulating interest rates or manipulating other market benchmarks. But it is a beginning. My overall view is the only way that you can root out serious wrongdoing from the financial markets and serious wrongdoing from the City of London is to punish the individuals responsible. And also, they should take that right up to the top level, because in many instances, the board directors were aware, despite their denials. So the only way that ultimately you can sort this out and root out the corruption is by having a powerful prosecutorial agency which goes after the villains. But at the moment, we do not have that.
What about the financial press? As a former finance editor for a national newspaper, what are your thoughts about the way the financial press has dealt with this? Because I must admit, I look at it and I sometimes think, well, maybe these guys are a little bit too close to the city.
You could certainly say that, and I think that this is a serious issue. There are some good financial journalists. There's a couple on the Wall Street Journal. There's 1 or 2 on the FT. Then it begins to dry up a little bit. But basically, the tendency for financial journalists in this country is to be far too close to the institutions they're writing about, and to basically often just give the party line, to be easily swayed by spin doctors or whatever, and not to do hard-edged investigations into what the banks, insurance companies, fund management companies, etc. are doing. This is a serious problem, and actually, it's they're letting down their readers by taking this approach.
But it's a bit difficult to dish the dirt on someone when they're whining and dining you.